Matthew chapter 2, let's start by reading the passage, Matthew 2, verses 1 through 12. Now, after Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea in the days of Herod the king, behold, wise men from the east came to Jerusalem, saying, "Where is he who has been born King of the Jews? For we saw his star when it rose and have come to worship him." When Herod the king heard this, he was troubled, and all Jerusalem with him. And assembling all the chief priests and scribes of the people, he inquired of them where the Christ was to be born. They told him, "In Bethlehem of Judea, for so it is written by the prophet, and you, O Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are by no means least among the rulers of Judah, for from you shall come a ruler who will shepherd my people Israel." Then Herod summoned the wise men secretly and ascertained from them what time the star had appeared. And he sent them to Bethlehem, saying, "Go and search diligently for the child, and when you have found him, bring me word that I too may come and worship him." After listening to the king, they went on their way, and behold, the star that they had seen when it rose went before them until it came to rest of the place where the child was. When they saw the star, they rejoiced exceedingly with great joy. And going into the house, they saw the child with Mary his mother. They fell down and worshipped him. Then, opening their treasures, they offered him gifts, gold and frankincense and myrrh. And being warned in a dream not to return to Herod, they departed to their own country by another way. On November the 4th, 2008, the first African-American president was elected as President of the United States. And I remember that election because it was the first election that I voted in. I turned 18 just a few weeks before that date, and I observed that there was many strong reactions to that election. There were millions of people who celebrated President Obama's victory, rejoiced in this hope and change for the future. Oprah Winfrey commented, "It feels like hope won. It feels like anything is possible." But there were many others who were really horrified at the election. They denounced Obama as a Marxist, comparing him to Hitler. One Catholic priest in South Carolina told his parishioners not to seek Holy Communion if they voted for Obama. On a global stage, Israel showed fear that Obama would be soft on Iran, while Kenya rejoiced that one they referred to as their native son had decisively won the presidency. And this isn't an anomaly. When a new leader comes on the scene, people respond in a variety of ways, right? Some submit with joy, others resist with defiance. Some are terrified, and others are just apathetic. Matthew chapter 2 gives us, I think, a side-by-side comparison of two responses to a new king. In chapter 1, Jesus has been introduced as the rightful heir to the eternal throne as promised to David's seed. And here in chapter 2, the wise men and King Herod are introduced as representing two very different responses to the king. I'd like to work through these verses 1 through 12 this morning in chapter 2, and I'd like to look at those two responses by these two groups of people because we all have a choice to make today. How will we respond to Jesus as king? Are you defiant, choosing to live your life by your own rules? Are you uncertain, unwilling to release your grip of control on your life? Maybe you're fearful, wondering if Jesus is always just and good. You're apathetic, disinterested in his purposes for your life. Or are you joyfully submissive, worshiping him as eternally worthy? So I have an opportunity to answer those questions. How will we respond to Jesus as king later? But before we start into this story, I think we need to look at some background to the birthplace of Jesus. Back to the election. One of the sources of contention during Obama's election and presidency was the legitimacy of his place of birth. I don't know if you remember that. There's conspiracies about false birth certificates and controversies over Obama's U.S. citizenship. And the reason for all those is because in order for Obama to be a legitimate candidate for the presidency, he had to be born in the United States. As we begin chapter 2, it's clear that Matthew Matthew here in this chapter is establishing the fact that Jesus was a legitimate candidate for the throne because of his place of birth. Look back at chapter 2, verse 1. It starts, Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea. If you were a Jewish person who was reading through the book of Matthew, you went through chapter 1, you get to the beginning of chapter 2, you can't help but notice this one word. It's already come up a couple times in chapter 1 and in different forms. Can you see what that word is? Go ahead and look at the beginning of verse 1 and tell me, what do you think that word is that's come up a couple times? There's just a few words there. That's the word born, okay? It comes up in different forms, but first time it's in Genesis 1:1. It is the genealogy of Jesus Christ. We find it then in chapter 1, verse 18, where it says the birth of Jesus Christ. And then here in chapter 2, verse 1, it says, now Jesus was born in Jerusalem. So this word that shows up these 3 times in kind of different forms could be translated the beginning or origin. We talked about that in past lessons. So I think one helpful way, as we're looking at chapter 2, and the beginning here of Matthew, one helpful way to break down these first 2 chapters is to use those different verses as division markers and see that in verse 1 through verse 17 of chapter 1, we find this ancestral origin of Christ, who he came from, his family connection. In verses 18 through 25, we found the physical origin of Christ, how he came, the miraculous conception. And then in chapter 2, verses 1, really to the rest of the chapter, we find the geographic origin of Christ, where he came from, his location. We're going to talk about the wise men and about King Herod in a little bit, but I want to take a moment here to talk about Bethlehem and why Bethlehem is important for Matthew to focus on here. Matthew he identifies Jesus' birthplace as Bethlehem of Judea, it says. And it's another way of saying like Bethlehem of Judah. And he uses this description, he says, of Judea, instead of just saying Bethlehem, because there was actually 2 Bethlehems in Matthew's day. I don't think I knew this until this last week. Does anybody know that there was 2 Bethlehems? There's one here, Bethlehem of Judah, that's just south of Jerusalem. And then there's also would be a Bethlehem of Galilee, a different city that was up by Nazareth in the territory of Zebulun. So it says here the Bethlehem of Judea. He's specifying that. Bethlehem, just to give you a background, where we see it in the Old Testament, Bethlehem of Judah was the place near where Rachel, Jacob's wife, died. Genesis 35 shows us that. So Rachel died. She was buried on the way to Ephrathah, that is Bethlehem. And Jacob set up an altar over her tomb. It is the pillar of Rachel's tomb, which is here to this day. That's the first instance that we find Bethlehem come up in Scripture. And the next we hear Bethlehem is in Judges 17, where this Levite from Bethlehem, he leaves his city to find a place. He wants to find a place of employment. So he ends up as a personal priest for this man named Micah in a house with a shrine and an ephod and household gods. In Judges 19, we get the next reference to Bethlehem, and we have another Levite who's leaving Bethlehem. But this one has a concubine, and he ends up committing this horrific atrocity. It's sickening to read, really, Judges 19. And we keep moving, and the next we have of Bethlehem is in Ruth chapter 1, where we come across yet another man who is leaving Bethlehem. It's Elimelech, and he dies shortly thereafter. And after these 3 men who are leaving Bethlehem, you might be wondering if anything good is going to come out of Bethlehem. And then we come to Boaz. And I'm not going to take Pastor Tim's thunder. He's getting worried over here. He's going to preach about Boaz in our 10:30 service. But Boaz changes the way we think about Bethlehem. It's no longer a place of death, as with Rachel. Or a place that sends out men who forsake God and commit these horrific acts. In Ruth, Bethlehem is a place where we find seeds of hope. And that hope is found in Boaz's seed. Obed, the father of Jesse, the father of David. David is from the line of Judah, the great-grandson of Boaz. And 1 Samuel 16, David is from Bethlehem, and he's anointed as king by Samuel. And although he would fail in many ways, he would be given a promise that one day a king would come from his descendants who would reign as king from an eternal throne. All right. We looked at Bethlehem through the Old Testament, and at this point, Bethlehem seems like an exciting place. Things are happening. And then everything is silent for the next 300 years. After David, after David in Samuel, books of Samuel, the only other mention of Bethlehem in the Old Testament is found in Micah 5, verse 2. Bethlehem is back on the map. Micah 5:2, but you, O Bethlehem Ephratah, who are too little to be among the clans of Judah, for from you shall come forth from me one who is to be ruler in Israel, whose coming forth is from of old, from ancient days. Who is this ruler who has no beginning, but would somehow find his earthly origin in the little town of Bethlehem? Matthew opens up the New Testament 700 years later and says, this is the one that you've been waiting for. Jesus is the ruler from of old. His ancestral origin is from the King David through Joseph, his legal father. His physical origin is by the Holy Spirit, and his geographical origin is from Bethlehem, as the prophet Micah said. In Matthew chapter 2, verses 5 and 6, we get that prophecy that's fulfilled. The Jewish religious leaders answer King Herod when he asks where the Messiah would be born. They point to Bethlehem by quoting Matthew 5:2. They say, in Bethlehem of Judea, for so it is written by the prophet, and you, O Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are by no means least among the rulers of Judah. For from you shall come a ruler who will shepherd my people, Israel. The beautiful picture here in Matthew 2 is of a shepherd king. Like David, the Messiah would come with authority of a king and a ruler, but also with a leadership and provision of a shepherd. Do you see that at the end of verse 6 in Matthew 2? I don't know if she's here today, but if you talk to Monica after the service, she'll tell you that a shepherd or a goat herder, is that a goat herd? What do you call a goat herder? If you have a shepherd, I don't know, I'll have to ask her. She'll tell you that a goat herder has to have authority over her animals. That's of primary importance. But perhaps the greatest need, in addition to that, would be that he or she know how to lead, how to provide for the sheep, for the goats. And if you don't know how to take care of them, if you don't know how to lead them, it's over. And oftentimes leadership with sheep or goats probably takes the form of going ahead of them and ensuring that they have provision and protection. Monica shared with me before how her dogs will run ahead of the goats and check the entire fence line, the boundary, to make sure there are no holes, ensuring the safety of the goats. In Matthew 2, here at the end of verse 6, it talks about Christ being not just the ruler, the king, but a shepherd. He is a shepherd king. So we find one more man in the line of men who have come out of Bethlehem. This man does not forsake God or sin against women like the Levites or even like King David. This man will be a righteous ruler in Israel, a perfect king. He will lead and provide for his people as a strong and faithful shepherd. This is the king that you and I serve. So if you're here this morning and you need direction for a decision, look to your shepherd king who leads. If you have a physical, emotional, spiritual needs, look to your shepherd king who provides. If you're overcome by fear and anxiety this morning, look to your shepherd king who protects, secures his own. If you're feeling like your life and your family and this world is out of control, look to your shepherd king who's ruling with authority. He is the answer. As we saw last week, he is with us. So now as we've focused on the place of Jesus' birth, let's go back to verse 1 and we'll look at the characters in the part of the story. It says in verse 1, after Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea in the days of Herod the king, behold, wise men from the east came to Jerusalem, saying, where is he who has been born King of the Jews? For we saw his star when it rose and have come to worship him. So in addition here in verse 1 to the special location of Bethlehem that's talked about, verse 1 introduces us to two new people, two groups of people. You have King Herod and the wise men from the east. So let's start by just considering the arrival of the wise men. We'll get to that question in a second. Who are the wise men, and why are they so important for Matthew's story? Just a few days ago, I was talking to my 4-year-old about this story, and he was trying to explain to me why there were only 3 wise men. I kept insisting to him that the Bible doesn't tell us how many there were, and he kept insisting that there were 3. I don't know if this is influenced by all the nativity scenes that he's seen or all the Bible storybooks that he's read. But the fact is that most of the traditions that we have about the wise men are just speculation. They probably weren't kings. They probably didn't arrive at a stable to see Jesus as an infant. And there might have been more than 3 of them. We just don't know. So what do we know about the wise men? Well, the Greek word that's used here, you probably heard before, magi, is a Persian word. And we know that 500 years before Jesus, there were magi in the area that today we know as Iran. So it's a good possibility that the magi came from modern-day Iran or Iraq. And that fits with the geography in verse 1, which says wise men came from the east to Jerusalem. Now we know generally where they came from, but what did they do? What was their occupation? Magi is a word from which we get the words magic and magician. Excuse me. Hold on. I'm going to pull off Pastor Tim. And in our day, we think of magicians or masters of sleight of hand when we think of magic. But the magi in that day, in that age, were probably pagan priests. They were men that were involved with sorcery and black magic and astrology. Kings sought their counsel because they brought special understanding, they thought, wisdom from their study of the stars. They were viewed as very wise men, and they probably had some role as political advisors to kings and other rulers. The point is they had a lot of influence. And it makes sense that the Magi would be involved with something like astrology because in our story it's very clear that the wise men were astronomers. Verse 2 says that they came to Jerusalem and said, "Where is he who has been born King of the Jews? We saw his star when it rose and have come to worship him." Now, I read that verse and my question reading that verse is, why would these Gentile wise men, possibly from hundreds of miles away, be interested in traveling so far to worship a baby Jewish king? And the fact is that it's impossible to know exactly what these particular magi knew or how they gained that knowledge. But in general, I think there's a few puzzle pieces that fit together to show us how the Magi might have learned about Israel's God and the prophecies about the Messiah. First of all, I'll just list some of these puzzle pieces, and you can see how they might have fit together. First, we know that the Magi were from the east. Second, about 500 years before Jesus was born, there were some Jews who were taken as captives to live in the east. You remember some of those captives? One's name is Daniel. We find this in Daniel 1 and chapter 5. They were first under the Babylonian Empire and then later under the Persian Empire. Third, we know that Daniel was one of those Jewish captives and who lived in the east, and he rose to this position of great influence, and as a prophet, he prophesied what? About the time of the coming of the Messiah, 483 years later. That's in Daniel chapter 9. So finally, the word magi shows up in Daniel 2 and verse 10. So These magi are listed with enchanters, sorcerers, astrologers in the king's court in Babylon. So, this is a guess, but we can guess that maybe there were Persian magi in Babylon who were under Daniel's authority, who learned from him about the true God in Israel and the prophecy of a Messiah who would come 483 years later. We know that that prophecy was preserved. So maybe it's possible that about 500 years later, there were still magi there who are aware of the prophecy, and they were aware that it was about time for that to be fulfilled. It had to be coming soon. If this is true, I think it's astounding to see how God preserved this knowledge in a Gentile nation so that 500 years later, a group of Gentile wise men would travel hundreds of miles to worship him as king. We don't know all the details for certain, but we do know that God receives worship from some of the most unlikely sources. Can you think of somebody who you would consider the last person to worship God? Maybe somebody in your family, one of your relatives, someone else that has been disinterested or just is so far from God. Don't give up on these people because God hasn't. So how did God direct the wise men to Jesus? Verse 2 says that they saw his star when it rose. So the logical next question is, what is the star? And I'm not going to ask for you to give me ideas of what you think the star is. There's a lot of speculations to what the star was. Some suggest it was a comet. Others says that it was a supernova. And others say it was this combination of the planets Jupiter and Saturn and Mars. So should we view this as this really natural phenomenon or as just a miracle? Some have even suggested that it's like the manifestation of the glory of God, like in the Old Testament when the bright, shining manifestation of God's presence is over the tabernacle. And I think this idea would fit nicely with the bright and shining announcement of Jesus' birth that came to the shepherds in Luke 2. But we don't know. I think it is interesting that many liberal theologians have difficulty accepting miracles. We talked about this the day we were talking about last week about miracles. A lot of them have difficulty accepting miracles in the Bible because they can't accept it scientifically, right? But here's an example where many conservatives do the same thing. Why do we feel like we have to explain the star as a natural phenomenon? Jesus' birth story is filled with miracles. So perhaps this is one as well. The reality is we are left in the dark when it comes to the nature of this star. But Matthew's point is bright and clear. God had provided a sign from heaven to guide the Magi to the Messiah. That's what we know. So I want to finish this section with one question. Was this star visible to anyone other than the Magi? And if so, why wouldn't people other than the Magi take notice? What about the people in Jerusalem? If we look back at our text together, let me set the stage for you as we move through the passage here. The wise men have probably come from hundreds of miles away, which means they probably have this substantial caravan of people and servants, food and provisions. And when they walk into Jerusalem, into the city, everyone notices. It's hard to hide this huge caravan. They notice not just because of how they look, but because they have something to say. It says that they came into the city and they said these words, "Where is he who has been born King of the Jews? For we saw his star when it rose and have come to worship him." So, who are they asking the question to? To whom were they addressing their question? We don't have a record that Herod met with the wise men until their secret meeting later in verse 7. So the wise men are probably entering Jerusalem and they're surprised that nobody is aware of the King of the Jews that has been born. And they weren't asking people about the birth. They are already convinced that Jesus is born. They're asking people where he was. Where is this one that has been born, King of the Jews? So the word gets to King Herod, and verse 3 gives us his response. Verse 3 says, "When Herod the king heard this, he was troubled, and all Jerusalem with him. And assembling all the chief priests and scribes of the people, he inquired of them where the Christ was to be born." Before we talk about Herod's alarm, we need some background to Herod, because there was actually a number of different Herods. This King Herod, also known as Herod the Great, was this legendary figure in history. Although he was half Jewish, he laid these really heavy taxes on the Jewish people. He was cruel, and he wouldn't put these Jews to work. They were involved with building some of the most notable construction projects of that era. He was cruel to the Jewish people, but he did rebuild the temple on this magnificent scale. He built Fortress Masada and Caesarea Maritima, which is this incredible city right by the Mediterranean Sea. He had numerous accomplishments, but he also had this insatiable paranoia that he would lose his position as a king. And as a result of that, Herod killed anyone that he felt was a threat to the throne, including his wife and at least 2 of his sons. Herod's Jewish heritage and his fierce jealousy explains why Emperor Caesar Augustus uttered his famous pun that he would rather be Herod's pig than his son, since Jews don't eat pork. Herod had a paranoia that he would lose his position as king. Verse 3 says that Herod was troubled, and when he heard this. And the word trouble there has this idea of great mental or emotional distress. So to the point of really being terrified. Matthew, I think I have it up here. Yeah, Matthew 14:26 says, when the disciples saw Jesus walking on the sea, they were terrified and said, "It is a ghost," and they cried out in fear. Sorry, part of that is not supposed to be part of the verse. This was probably in the last year of Herod's reign, the last year of his life. So there's a point of desperation. He's terrified. But the verse says that he wasn't the only one terrified. What does it say? It says the city also. So why was the whole city troubled? What do you think? Any ideas? Yeah, Tim?
Well, probably because they knew Herod's reputation for ruthlessness, and so if he's freaking out about something, they are concerned that bad things are going to
What's coming down the pike? Exactly. Yeah, for sure. The city was fully aware of the message, right? Because the Magi had come into the city and shared that. And they're aware of the message that the wise men had brought into town. And they knew from experience that whatever King Herod's response would be, it would be devastating. One can only imagine what would happen if Herod was in a fit of jealousy for his throne. So they're so fearful that the news of this new king, what it would mean for them because of terror, because of King Herod. And they're terrified. They're terrified instead of being hopeful. Have you ever found yourself in this place, the place of those people in Jerusalem? Terrified because of what someone in power might do. The city was terrified even though their source of hope had finally arrived. The King of the Jews, the Messiah, was born. And yet they're so busy worrying about King Herod's reaction that they mirrored that same response. Are you so alarmed about what others might say or do that you lose sight of the arrival of King Jesus? For whatever reason, my boys are terrified of dogs. Not cats, but dogs. Not sure why that is. If Lorraine was here, she'd have something to say about that. It doesn't matter if the dog is on a leash or if I'm standing right there in between my boys and the dog. They seem to lose sight of some of these realities and instead focus on what that dog might do to them. And I do the very same thing. Have you ever been terrified of what family or friend might say or do to you that you neglected to talk to them about Jesus, the good news of salvation, hope of eternal life? Have you ever been terrified about the state of our country after watching the news and you lost focus of the one who's setting up kings and removing kings at his command? John 14, verse 27 says, "Peace I leave with you, my peace I give to you. Not as the world gives do I give to you. Let not your hearts be troubled, be terrified. Neither let them be afraid." There is no reason to fear. And Herod's alarms leads him to take steps towards eliminating his next threat. So in verse 7, it says, "Then Herod summoned the wise men secretly and ascertained from them what time the star had appeared. And he sent them to Bethlehem, saying, 'Go and search diligently for the child, and when you have found him, bring me word that I too may come to worship him.'" He probably meets with the Magi here in secret because he doesn't want to arouse any more suspicion. There's things floating around in public, and he doesn't want to confirm those. He feigns interest in following their example of worship, the Magi's worship of King Jesus. And although we know that this has to be a lie, he just wanted more information, as we'll see later, about his exact location. He already knew that Jesus would be in Bethlehem, but he wanted to know how old the child was. This would help him later when he pursued to king, when he ended up killing all the children under 2 years old. So I can imagine the Magi walking out of King Herod's palace and saying to each other, after they received that information by the scribes and Pharisees that he would be born in Bethlehem that we talked about earlier in verses 5 and 6. They walk out of that place, that palace, and they say to each other, "Well, we know it's in Bethlehem, but how are we going to know the place? How are we going to know the house? Where are we going to find him?" And God allows the star to reappear. Not only does the star reappear, but it's moving, so it leads them to the Messiah. Verse 9 says, "After listening to the king, they went on their way, and behold, the star that they had seen when it rose went before them until it came to rest over the place where the child was." Some people will take this verse to mean that the star only appeared to move. How many of you have been driving in the car before, and at night you look out and you see the stars, and it looks like they're moving? The problem is, I don't think that's the case because God's word says that the star actually moved. This isn't just from their perspective. Not only did it move, but it actually rested. It rested right over the place where the child was, which means that somehow it must have descended in some way so as to identify the house where Jesus was living with his parents. This is a miracle. Verse 10 gives us insight into the excitement of the Magi when the star reappeared. It says, when they saw the star, they rejoiced exceedingly with great joy. So are they rejoicing because the star reappeared, or because they're closer to seeing the Messiah, to giving him their gifts? They've probably been on this trip for many months. And it's hard to describe the excitement that they have. I mean, if you're a grandparent, you know what it's like to rejoice in the birth of your first grandchild and to see him or her for the first time. There is never this sliver of just mere duty with the Magi. This is an absolute joy for them because they're excited for the opportunity to worship the King of the Jews. And that's what we found in verse 11. It says, going into the house, they saw the child with Mary, his mother. They fell down and worshipped him. Then, opening their treasures, they offered him gifts, gold and frankincense and myrrh. Now, because of Herod's response and later in verse 16, and the fact that they have probably take the wise men a long time to come here, from wherever they were in the east, and the fact that the word for child here is not the word for infant, For all these reasons, I think it's safe to say that Jesus was not a baby anymore. We know that he was under 2 years old because of what Herod did later in killing all that was under 2, but he probably wasn't an infant. Now, at this point, you come to this part in the passage, and I know one of the questions I asked myself was, why was Jesus still in Bethlehem? We know that Joseph had to go there because of the census, to be registered, but why is he still there? It's apparent that they're no longer in this little animal shelter where Jesus was born. They've occupied a house now. They'd moved into a house. We don't know if it was a relative's home or what, but according to Luke 2, Joseph had left Nazareth to be registered in Bethlehem in obedience to the decree by Caesar Augustus. So why didn't he return? Why didn't he go back to Nazareth? And it's a good question, and it's another one that we just don't know the answer to. Perhaps he didn't want to return because all those people that would, how they would view him, since he had taken Mary in a kind of a questionable situation, at least from their perspective. Or perhaps he himself had recalled the prophecy that the Messiah would come from Bethlehem. So he purposed to settle there, even though it meant leaving family and friends back in Nazareth. Whatever the reason is, they were located, and this is where the wise men were to meet them. The verse says, the wise men fell down and worshipped him. They saw Mary too, but they worshipped the child. We don't know all that was in their hearts or why they bowed down to the ground, but it does seem like an act of humility, submission. They weren't submitting to Jesus because of what he had done for them, but because of who he was. And I wouldn't be surprised if they knew, like King Herod, that this was the prophesied and long-awaited Messiah. Not only did they bow down in worship, but they also gave royal gifts to him. The verse says they offered gifts, gold, frankincense, and myrrh. Gold was a really precious metal, often associated with royalty. Frankincense and myrrh were both forms of incense made from tree resin. Frankincense was often used in rituals toward God, like prayer, and myrrh was often used in rituals about man, like relieving pain or preparing the body for burial. So is there a particular symbolism in these gifts? I know there's a lot of Bible connections through the Old Testament to gold, frankincense, and myrrh that we could explore. One of the early Christian leaders said they gave gold as to a king, myrrh as to one who was mortal, and an incense as to God. And what we do know is that these gifts were lavish, and they're befitting of someone of royalty. Have you ever given something really valuable to a child? I'm imagining my 1 or 2 year old trying to open presents on Christmas time, and I'm trying to picture what it must have looked like for them to offer, this baby these expensive gifts. In some way, it must have looked probably kind of ridiculous to onlookers who didn't know anything about who this baby was. Can you imagine multiple very distinguished grown men bowing down before this toddler and offering him gold and expensive incenses? Do you ever feel embarrassed about your submission, your service for the Lord? Are you self-conscious about how other people will view your response to God as king? Maybe you have biblical convictions that your relatives don't understand or appreciate. Maybe you have coworkers who really resent your diligence and your integrity because it makes them look bad. Are you willing to offer lavish gifts to the Lord even when it's costly and may appear foolish? Will you joyfully submit to him even though those around you don't understand? The Magi didn't feel ridiculous because they knew who they were worshiping. He was the king. And if you're self-conscious about your Christianity, maybe we need to step back and consider who we are serving. The King of creation is worthy of our love and service and devotion regardless of what it looks like to others. If we look back at the offering of the wise men there in the verse, we know that the offering wasn't foolish. It wasn't ridiculous, but it was providential. We'll read about next week how Mary and Joseph would have to flee Egypt. And no doubt these gifts, expensive gifts, would supply for their traveling needs. All right. Matthew 1. In Matthew 1, Matthew spent the entire chapter showing us that Jesus is king. Not just the king of the Jews, but the king that will sit on David's eternal throne. He is the king of creation, the king over every nation and every person. As we looked at today, chapter 2 contrasts the response of the Magi with the responses of Herod. Throughout the chapter, we've seen two very different responses to the birth of King Jesus. If you look at the verbs through chapter 2, you'll find that the Magi, they looked, they traveled, they searched, they rejoiced, they bowed down, they worshiped, they opened and offered. They departed, which means they disobeyed King Herod. In contrast, the King Herod feared. He assembled, he inquired, he summoned, he searched, he destroyed, he raged, he killed, and then he died later down in the chapter. And if you look down this list, you might not find yourself in these responses. Maybe you do. But maybe you're to this morning in a different category. What about those citizens in Jerusalem, those residents of Jerusalem? What about the Sanhedrin, the chief priests? How did they respond? They knew about the Old Testament prophecy. They were aware that the wise men had come to worship the King of the Jews, that even Herod had connected to the Messiah. Why did they fail to follow him? Or what about those people in the small city of Bethlehem who must have watched the Magi's caravan come into this small town and stop at the house where Joseph and Mary were staying? You see, in addition to the worshipful response of the Magi and this really vengeful response of King Herod, there's this absent response by the residents of Jerusalem and Bethlehem. Their silence reveals their complacence. They are sadly apathetic. So how will you respond to Jesus as king? Because it impacts the way you treat your spouse, the way you drive to work, the way you play with your kids, the way you sing hymns in a few moments in our worship service. Are you apathetic? Are you terrified of having Jesus as king of your life? Or are you rejoicing and worshiping and offering to him your heart and your life? How will you respond to Jesus as king? Let's take a moment right now to do that, to respond to him in submission with joy together.